corporations question from February of 2002 may be about as difficult a corporation's fact pattern as the Committee of Bar Examiners can come up with. This is a racehorse question. It is testing a fairly substantial percentage of the outline of law from the subject of corporations, and an applicant is well advised to have a clear analytical approach in mind, both to the basics of essay organization and to corporations law, in order to handle this fact pattern well. Have a look at the call of the question. 1. Did Paul violate any securities laws? Discuss. Well, we can break this one up easily before we even read the fact pattern. We know that the two statutes that we are responsible for on the California bar are Rule 10b-5 and Rule 16b, and it's the same across the country. Both of these statutes are going to be in place substantially, as it turns out. In question 2, we are asked, did Paul breach any duties to Acme and or its shareholders? Discuss. This implies a two-part answer as well. And then 3. Did the board breach any duties to Acme and or its shareholders? Discuss. Here again, two subparts are implied. The actual consideration of the facts can vary a fair amount, as well as the organization. This is not a fact pattern that you really had to organize in any particular fashion. But this certainly is a fact pattern that, with good skills in place, one is inclined to do very specific things. So let's briefly review the fact pattern before we get into the analysis. In paragraph 1, we meet Acme Corporation, a publicly traded company that operates shopping malls. A lot of these malls have unrented commercial space due to an economic slowdown. Plus, there's a lot of additional retail space near many of these malls, and it prevents the company from raising rents despite increasing costs. So, here in paragraph 1, we find out that Acme Corporation is in a fair amount of trouble. In paragraph 2, we learn about the events of June '01. Here, Sally, president and sole owner of Bigco, approaches Paul, Acme's president. She proposes a cash-out merger in which Bigco would purchase for cash all shares of Acme, and Acme would merge into Bigco. Sally offered $100 each for outstanding shares of stock, even though the stock was currently trading at $50 per share, and historically had never traded for higher than $60 per share. Well, at first blush, this offer looks like a no-brainer, a one-question IQ test. Double your money overnight and save a company that is facing very severe economic pressures. Fair enough. But read on. In the following paragraph, we get the real meat that is going to be the source of our analysis to follow. Paul is concerned about Acme's future, and that seems like an entirely valid concern. He decides, in good faith, to pursue the merger. Okay? Still, fair enough. We know that Paul is going to be one of our principal defendants as we analyze the facts. So, read on. The next sentence gives rise to statutory liability under the federal securities laws. In July '01, before discussing the deal with anyone, Paul telephones his broker and purchases 5,000 shares of Acme at $50 per share. Once again, we have to pause to salute greed. Then, Paul presents the proposed merger to the board of directors and urges them to approve it. The board met, discussed the difference between the current market share price and the offer price, and without commissioning a corporation valuation study, decided to submit the decision to the shareholders. The shareholders overwhelmingly approved the deal because of the immediate profit they would realize. Based solely on shareholder approval, the board unanimously approved the merger, and all shareholders received cash for their shares. Okay, let's pause for a moment. This looks like a great deal. The company has been saved from a bleak financial outlook, and all of the shareholders have doubled their money. Most of us who have spent any time doing corporate work would be delighted with this outcome. But now read the last paragraph. In December '01, shortly after completing the merger, Bigco closed most of the Acme malls and sold the properties at a substantial profit to a developer who intended to develop them for light industrial use. Well, that means that this corporate valuation study almost certainly would have netted information that would have suggested that Sally's offer wasn't as good as it looked superficially. And that's part of the trick to writing a good, simple answer to this question. Our answer to this question should reflect that Sally's offer looked a lot better than it really was. And so the board of directors should have engaged in more due diligence before rushing to collect this money. So now we get the call of the question again, and once again, we see that these are straightforward questions being asked about facts that really are not very ambiguous. So now turn the page and have a look at the outline of issues that I've presented. First, we deal with the securities law issues. And here, this is not very difficult intellectually. All we're doing is applying the law to the facts. Notice with regard to 10b-5 on this outline, I'm not doing anything very intellectual. I'm just breaking it up into elements. We focus on Paul's insider status, then we look at the inside information. Paul's scienter is obvious, but we have to make it equally obvious in our answer. Then interstate commerce, and we reach a conclusion. Now, would it be okay to squish this all up into one big fat paragraph on 10b-5? Of course. I break it up into this much refined detail because I can and because I think there's time to do the analysis well. But if you write one paragraph that contains this information, you're probably in good shape. I break it up to this extent because I want to make it easy for the grader to see that the author knows what he's writing about and has done a competent job. Fair enough. Now we turn to 16b, and once again, it's not hard intellectually. We've got to set it up appropriately, explain exactly why it is that this defendant, Paul, would be appropriate for a 16b action. Then we focus on his short swing profits. We reach a simple conclusion. The bottom line is Paul has violated both Rule 10b-5 and Rule 16b, and he is liable. It's simple enough. Next, we focus on Paul's potential breaches of duty, both to Acme and to its shareholders. As it turns out, I didn't have separate sections for breach to Acme and breach to the shareholders because these breaches all line up pretty nicely. So we focus on the duty of loyalty and then the duty of care and the business judgment rule. And here, it's obvious that Paul is liable, and it seems to me also that there is a correct answer to this question. If you argue that Paul didn't breach his duty of loyalty, I just think you're flatly wrong, and I think you ought to lose a lot of points in your answer. With regard to the duty of care and the business judgment rule, here there is plenty to write about. And I've seen passing answers where actually the duty of care was found not to have been breached. Now, I think that's a stretch, and I think it's clear that Paul did breach the duty of care and the business judgment rule. But there is room for reasonable people to differ a little bit here. The bottom line, I conclude that Paul was disloyal and careless. He's liable. Next, we focus on the board of directors. Here, again, we're not doing anything very complicated. We are focusing on the duty of loyalty. Here, the board itself doesn't appear to have acted out of any self-interest, so probably there's no breach of the duty of loyalty. But with regard to a breach of the duty of care, it seems after a little bit of subtle analysis that the board should have done more. So I conclude that the board did breach its duty of care. Okay, fair enough. Now, please turn to the answer. And although I'm not going to make any new points legally, I do think there are a number of paragraphs that are worth your attention. I think this is another answer that serves as a showcase for the various techniques that I'm trying to present. This is a well-organized answer. It hits all of the issues. It meticulously analyzes the facts. And I think that some of the examples of analysis could stand you in good stead. So take a look at the very first paragraph in the answer that I present. I lead with the facts. I explain who Paul is, and concisely, I explain what he did. Up front, I explain the two securities laws that we will analyze, 10b-5 and 16b. And I throw in not really a definition, but a very concise explanation of what these two statutes do. I think you'll agree they are accurate and reasonably complete statements. Next, I focus on Paul's potential liability under 10b-5. And here, up front, I explain the law in a little bit more depth. I explain that 10b-5 combats insider trading, I define insiders, and I define insider trading. I also indicate what the elements of Rule 10b-5 are. So, I think it's appropriate to present a reasonable amount of law in any answer. But this question, in particular, does call for clear recitation of law because it makes the analysis so much easier and more concise. So, next I focus on Paul's insider status. That's easy to do. I do it in a couple of simple sentences. Next, I focus on the inside information and the insider trade that was done by Paul as a result of his insider knowledge of Sally's offer. Next, I focus on scienter, and here it is obvious that this guy Paul made a trade based on inside information with an intent to achieve a profit. And he called his broker, and that's good enough to satisfy interstate commerce. So, I conclude that Paul violated 10b-5. He used inside information for his own personal advantage by purchasing 5,000 shares of Acme stock even before he disclosed Sally's offer to the board. Next, we focus on 16b. I point out up front that this statute really is a strict liability statute because of the absence of a scienter requirement. I explain what 16b requires for liability, and I indicate a little bit of law up front. Next, I focus on Paul as an appropriate defendant. He is president of Acme and thus an appropriate defendant. He also has obtained short swing profits. Here, in the section on short swing profits, I explain exactly what happened, and I even do a little bit of simple arithmetic to conclude this gentleman made $250,000 in short swing profits, and I explain he is liable, and that's the conclusion, and he's got to disgorge this profit. Fair enough. This defendant has violated both 10b-5 and 16b, and that's my conclusion. Next, we turn to Paul's possible breaches of duty to Acme and to the shareholders. I indicate that he owes duties of loyalty and care both to the corporation and to the shareholders. Here, the breaches are breaches both to the company and to the shareholders. First, we focus on the duty of loyalty. We've covered a little bit of this ground before, but we are explaining it in a somewhat different context. I explain what Paul's duty of loyalty is, and I focus on his breach. He is legitimately concerned about Acme's future. However, his purchase of 5,000 shares clearly violates the securities laws. I refer to my earlier analysis. This defendant decided the merger was appropriate, and he sought to profit personally from his insider knowledge. So he has breached his duty of loyalty, both to the company and to the shareholders. Next, we focus on the business judgment rule and the duty of care. Here, up front, I lead with a little bit of law. Paul's duty of care requires that he act as a fiduciary to Acme, and throughout his term as president, this guy must exercise prudent business judgment, and if he fails to do so, he's liable. So, next, we focus on the analysis, and it takes me 3 paragraphs of fairly in-depth analysis to handle it. And here I counsel you to have a look at this answer with some care. I think these paragraphs are a very good example of sharp, clear, thorough, detailed analysis. And it seems to me you are never going to learn to do this merely by studying outlines. The only way to learn how to do this is by studying good answers and writing increasingly strong answers yourself. You must practice this to learn how to do it. So, look at the analysis. In the second paragraph, under duty of care and the business judgment rule, I focus on just how tough a situation Acme was facing. And I point out that Sally's offer appears to be a win-win situation because Acme is saved from trouble, all the shareholders double their money, and we go on with a happy life. So I indicate in the next paragraph that it's kind of hard to argue with a business decision that realizes 100% profit for all the shareholders in a declining market. But I think that still this large cash offer ought to have clued in Paul and the board of directors to consider more carefully the actual value of all these assets Acme held. The shareholders approved the deal, the board of directors approved the merger. So I suggest that it might be a close call as to whether or not Paul is liable for a breach of his duty of care. And as I indicated up front, a fair number of successful candidates agreed that because this deal was so lucrative, Paul didn't breach his duty of care. Still, I think the more subtle and the better answer is that Paul breached his duty of care to Acme and its shareholders because they jumped too quickly. Paul urged acceptance of this deal rather than taking a step back and considering that these assets might have greater value. So I conclude that Paul is liable both to Acme and to the other shareholders for breaching these duties of loyalty and care. Next, we focus on the board's possible liability, and here, up front, I indicate what the law is. A corporate board of directors also owes duties of loyalty and care, both to the company and to the shareholders. I focus on what the board did, and then we go into the analysis in somewhat greater depth. There's clearly no evidence that the board of directors breached its duty of loyalty. It doesn't look as if they put their personal interests ahead of those of the company or the shareholders. The only disloyal insider was Paul, who achieved short swing profits by insider trading. So, as to the board as a whole, there's no breach of the duty of loyalty. With regard to the breach of the duty of care alleged, I reach the opposite conclusion. Here, it seems to me that the board did breach its duty of care, because a reasonably prudent board would have taken a little bit more time to get a corporate evaluation and determine the true value of the assets. Their failure to commission a corporate valuation study is a breach of their duty of care, in my judgment. Others disagreed and still were able to achieve passing scores. But as we think about this issue logically, applying our knowledge of the law and our appreciation for what happened, it seems evident that the board should have been put on notice by this lucrative offer from Sally that it was time to do a little bit more research. And that wraps up a consideration of what I consider to be a challenging and difficult corporations question, one that involves both a full consideration of all the securities laws that we're responsible for knowing, and also a fairly subtle and sophisticated analysis of the corporation duties of loyalty and duty of care.